So we have actually five faculty members that are going to do this with us. And tonight we have Dr. Gregory Moore, who is with the History Department. So each of them is going to spend a little bit of time talking about the distinctive way of seeing through the eyes of a historian, followed by art. And I would think that questions are welcome.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you all for having me here tonight. I took a look at the chapter by Gardner, and while I find myself in certain levels of disagreement with him, partly because I don't think he fully understands completely the disciplines he writes about, certainly I don't think he understands my discipline as well as he might, although he gets some things right, which I'll point to shortly. I want to start with something that we do in my survey class. Before we actually start dealing with it, I'm an American historian by training, particularly in American diplomatic history. But since I've been at Notre Dame, I've been a generalist, so I teach very much across the historical curriculum these days, which is frankly more fun. We begin the class by talking about what history is, because a lot of times we just jump right into the story and the names and dates, and we don't stop to think about the discipline itself, which is truly a unique discipline simply because it has no borders. Heard of Doctors Without Borders? Well, historians have no borders at all whatsoever. In fact, Rachel's discipline and mine are quite similar in that regard, that there's almost nothing that limits us in what we want to explore or investigate. And we begin with the quotation from Dr. Kissinger. I have the students actually research quotations about history and have them write about what resonates with them on this. But I came across this quotation from Dr. Kissinger. You hopefully remember Dr. Kissinger as former Secretary of State, National Security Advisor for Presidents Nixon and Ford. Before Kissinger was a bureaucrat, he was a historian. He was Harvard trained, wrote about Metternich diplomacy for his doctoral dissertation. But what he says really, I think, captures what history is all about, in that we're not a discipline that deals in absolutes. We don't deal in absolutes because we don't ever have all the data to help us tell the story of human endeavors. It's not a cookbook. There are no pre-tested recipes. When my colleagues from the science division come in, one of the things they can do is observe and repeat experiments. I can't go back in time and replay the Civil War and have the South win and see what can happen. I can conduct thought experiments and think about alternative scenarios where the South wins, which is an important thing to do because then it allows me and it helps me think about the results as they turned out by considering alternatives. We can illuminate, again, we teach by analogy. We teach by analogy, and I'm going to mention some books for those of you who may teach history that I seriously encourage you to read before you get too deeply involved in teaching the discipline. We don't have laws. There are no historical laws. There are no maxims. There are only analogies. This situation is analogous to that. But it's also important to understand not only how situations are alike, but how they differ as well. And every generation, the reason that this is something Gardner also gets right, we do rewrite history every generation because, as Kissinger says, every generation has to discover for itself which situations from the past are comparable to the present. Gardner talks about opening a window to the social sciences. I have to draw the line there. We are not social scientists. We are not in the business of predicting human behavior as historians. We study the past. We study the consequences of human actions, no matter what they may be. And in all honesty, we have egos big enough that if you ask us how we think things might work out in the future, we'll take a stab at it, but we're not in the job of predictive behavior. That's the big difference between us and the social scientists. So that's a key component in how I look at the world and how I think within my discipline and how others do. We We deal with everything you can think of in dealing with historical research, such as artifacts. You want to take a guess? This is a book rack, footrest, red toaster, decorative ornament. How many want to go for decorative ornament? There's one. How many think it's a footrest? No? Book rack? Pretty good. You actually really think that's a toaster?
No.
It is. It is a toaster. Yes, it is. And what you can see the handle, you stuck the bread in here, and there you go. This is an 18th century American colonial toaster. What do we think about when we look at this? Well, this tells us something about colonial life. What kind of people would have an implement like this? Is this something you'd find in the frontier? Not likely. Is this something you might find in a home of a well-to-do person in Boston, Charleston, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia? Yeah. But it's an indication of some aspects of colonial life. People actually toasted bread. So we had some good breakfast. Okay. You obviously think of historians as dealing with all those dusty piles of documents, and having done research in the National Archives, there is a lot of dust. You may recognize this one. I think you probably heard of this document along the way. This is a contemporary document. It's a primary document. We have to recognize between the contemporary and the secondary. And we have to evaluate them. It's very important to understand what is being said in the document. It's also very important to understand what is not being said. There is a kind of yin-yang to historical research. It's not only what you have, it's what you don't have that can formulate the questions that you think about. And guys, it's not about names and dates. It's an illustration. This doesn't come up very well on screen. It's an illustration of a slave ship. If you could see this in better detail, you would see that you have a lot of smiling faces here. Would you equate that with the voyage from Africa to the New World? I wouldn't. But it still tells us something about certain attitudes about slavery in the 19th century. Battle of Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. The battle's over. The Union is won. But what does this tell us about the realities of war? Things that we think about. Here's some real cowboys. Not like what you see on TV. Real Indians. This is Geronimo. Think this is a staged photograph? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Believe me, when he was running around northern Mexico and Arizona, he wasn't posing for photographs, okay? This was after he had surrendered to Crook's army and has been moved to the reservation in the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Just finished an election. This is a Republican campaign banner poster from 1900. The comparison between the situation in the country in 1896, when McKinley was elected and the Democrats were leaving power, running the bank, everybody's pulling their money out. Spanish rule in Cuba. We see the concentration camps there. We see people out of work. We see businesses shut down. Now 1900, 4 years of Republican rule. Country's prosperous, people are working, people are putting money in the bank. Cuba is liberated thanks to the efforts of good old Ohio's Bill McKinley and some young upstart named Roosevelt, who goes on to have a so-called, so-called political career. Urban life, 1900, thereabouts. Does this picture look natural? Kind of does. Kind of gives us an insight into what a tenement flat looked like in New York City around 1900, 1905 or so. Immigrant family, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 kids. Let you know a little secret. This photograph, in fact, was staged and cropped to convey the message that the photographers wanted to convey. This is another thing that you have to think about. The evidence you look at has to be evaluated to determine its validity, its truthfulness. And you can't take things at face value as a historian. absolutely cannot do so. You have to evaluate the evidence that's presented before you. World problems in 1920. Gosh, this looks like could be right now. Let's see. We got problems in Mexico. Sounds familiar. Costa Rica had some problems back then. Oh, here's terrorism. And the world's recovering from years of war. We've got socialism, communism, Bolshevism, and labor issues and economic issues and so forth. Could be right out of today's headlines. So for those of you who like George Santayana's comment about those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, well, you can refer to this cartoon if you like to. Again, this projector's bulb is obviously wearing out. This is one of Margaret Bourke White's famous photographs of the Oakey family coming from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The photograph of the woman right here holding her baby. She took a second photo, a close-up of this woman and her baby, which won her the Pulitzer Prize for photography, the famous Cover of Life magazine back then. One of the wonderful things about film and photography is that it brings the human condition vibrantly forward for historians. What about comic books? You ever think about comic books for a way of evaluating history and thinking about history? That's my old friend Captain America, and this was published around March of 1940 or 41. We're not even in the war yet, but even comic books are valuable as insights into social history. And this tells us a lot about growing American attitudes. Here's Cap knocking out Hitler, bullets bouncing off the original shield, not the round shield that we associate with him today. We introduced the famous Bucky, his teenage companion, which became a part of things. This could have been my house in the late 50s, early 60s. Look at that TV. Drinking a Coke. Today, we're in front of a computer screen, surfing the net, Facebooking, this kind of thing. But this is typical. History encompasses every aspect of human endeavor. Elvis, the revolution in music that begins in the late 50s, that has uniquely helped shape the generations to follow. Again, my era. Get the hell out of Vietnam, okay? You ever stop to think how many American wars have actually been popular? I can name you one. World War II. Almost every other American war has been confronted by protest, including the American Revolution. Sports and civil rights converging at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who finished first and third in the 100-yard dash. They had 2 black gloves. They took each took a glove, made the Black Power salute. They got sent home very shortly after that. All right. Nixon's resignation. Succinct to the point, I quit. Well, it's in legalese. I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. I quit. Okay. Man on the moon, I can tell you exactly where I was when Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon. I can tell you right to the second where I was. I can in almost every one of these events. History is an incredibly personal thing. It's more than an academic discipline. It's an intensely personal thing. Every one of you is affected by history because every one of you has a history. Never forget that. My students usually refer to that. Satellite photograph of the Twin Towers on 9/11. For the artist. This is a painting that's on the cover of a book that I have my students read in our historical methods class. It's called The Landscape of History. John Lewis Gaddis. Professor Gaddis made his mark as a historian by writing about the origins of the Cold War, and he came up with a consensus view that is still largely accepted today,